We had a lot of people working on this project, and we've been doing this work since 2015, 2016. And this last study that we've worked on was in 2021 and 2022. And I got a PhD student, Landon Sullivan, who was the primary lead on that. So our goal was to, in some of our other earlier studies that I'll show you in a minute, we've detected some differences between what we call efficient and inefficient animals and how they engage in grazing. And we found some differences with the inefficient animals, maybe not being as heat tolerant, more stressed. And so my graduate student, he wanted to test using an injectable mineral in those animals and see if it made a difference in their grazing behavior. And of course, that affects production. So let me share some of that background information. And I'll start off by just quoting my favorite philosopher in the world. You can observe a lot by just watching. And we've been doing a lot of grazing research for a long, long time. Look at that truck there, and that's an old one. And so that research photo was taken in 1937, and they were doing grazing behavior research back then. And I've done some research like that on my PhD project, and with a clipboard in a deer tower, writing things down every 5 minutes. But we've got some better tools now here, and we call this rocket science on the range. And so the grazing collars that we use have a GPS module, and you know what those are and what they do for you. And then it also has an accelerometer. And so the accelerometers are used on rockets, and it's just like what it sounds. How much acceleration you got, how much velocity. And it measures velocity in 3 directions: up and down, side to side, backward and forward. So if you pair that with the head movements of an animal, you can determine what they're doing out there. So think about that for a minute. If the cow is grazing, her head's going to be close to the ground, right? And if she's walking, unless she's walking from one grazing spot to another, she's going to raise her head up. And each time one front foot hits the ground, the head's going to bob from side to side. And of course, if they're resting, you don't have much head movement. So we can, with the GPS, we can tell where they're at. But with the accelerometer, we can tell what they're doing while they're there. And so the GPS unit, we had it on our experiment set to record location every 5 to 7 minutes. The accelerometer, you get a lot of data, 25 times a second. That's not a typo, that's real, 25 times a second. So you get a lot of data every day. And here's just a slide of some GPS points, and you can see she's she starts off from midnight till 5 in the morning. She's laying down resting here, and then she gets up and grazes for about 3.5 hours. She rests for a few minutes, and then she walks down the water, and then she rests there till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and she gets up and grazes. She rests here for an hour, and then from about 7 till 10 p.m. in the summertime here, she's grazing till she goes and beds down again. If we look at that with the accelerometer incorporated, the size of these circles indicate more movement. So you can see this great big circle here, and that's when she was running to water. And these more medium-sized circles, that's her grazing, walking. And then these little circles, these little blue circles is just when she's resting. So at the Nancy M. Cummings Research Extension Education Center, where I'm housed, we test all yearling heifers for feed efficiency. And we do that with these, they used to be called growth safe units, and they're now called Vitality units. And there's a scale underneath where the feed is in the bunk, and only one animal can go into the bunk at a time. And they have an RFID tag, just like at the grocery store. So it'll tell you who's there, and then it weighs how much she eats. And then we take and we compare that feed intake to what we'd expect based on her weight and her animal performance. And, you know, we've been doing nutritional studies since the early 1900s, so we can decide if they eat more than expected compared to their group, or if they eat less than expected. If they eat more feed than we expect, then we would call them inefficient. And if they eat less than we would expect, we call them efficient. So we've been doing this type of research since the 80s in science, and we wanted to know if animals that are efficient in that setting are also more efficient on a rangeland setting. They haven't done much of that. I think we're some of the first in the world to do that. And so you can see that's a couple of 2-year-old cows on Rinker Rock Creek Ranch, where a lot of our research occurred. And there's Carmen Wilmore, some of you know her. And so there's some terrain. And so the important things that we want to look at for efficiency on rangeland would be forage intake and grazing behavior and animal production. We have published a paper that outlines how you can use this equipment to determine grazing behavior on beef cattle. When I started this research in 2015, working with these accelerometers, when I did a literature search, I found a paper with elephants. And that didn't help me a whole lot. And so we fumbled around in the dark for a year or so, and we figured it out, I think. So in order to use this equipment, you have to calibrate each animal. And so think about this. Do we all walk the same? Do we all eat the same? We don't, do we? There's variation. I like to use an analogy. I work in an office that has a wooden floor, and when Dr. Hall over here is walking down the hallway, I don't have to go look out in the hallway to see who's walking down the hall. I can tell from the sounds of its footsteps. And so each animal is different, so we spend 3 or 4 days evaluating each animal, and we observe them in the morning grazing bout and in the evening grazing bout, about 3 or 4 hours each time, and in the middle part of the day when they lay down. And we get their walking behavior when we take them to the pasture. So we get data signatures with that, and we use these touchpad computers, and we have these timestamps built in. So we just tap a button and it starts an activity, and then we tap it again and it ends it. And so we get our data from that. And so we're trying to classify a lot of data, 2.16 million lines of data per day per cow. We average it down to 180,000 lines of data, and we have to predict all that data for all the days they have the collars with our observed data. So we get several hours of data, and it's like taking a drop of water here in a liter of water. But the way we handle that is we look at all the possible combinations over the entire range of the data, and we get these bell curves for the different activities using some different formulas. And so, for instance, anything above this number with this particular equation is resting. Anything below this number is grazing, and walking is just whatever's left over. So that's how we do it. We use what's called machine learning to help us run this data because the data sets are really large. And we're just think probability. You're thinking probability. And think of the bell curve. So you can see the restings real easy to break out because there's not much movement. Okay, so now that I've explained that, let's talk about some of the data we collected. So some of the first data we collected was over at Du Bois. And this was the very first study we did when I came up here in 2015. And we had efficient and inefficient cows that were coming 3 years old. And they were put out on that rangeland there on late season dormant forage with no protein supplement. So everybody lost weight. But the efficient animals, they lost less weight than the inefficient animals, and they were less variable. See, they were pretty tight here, and these inefficient animals, this is the spread of the data, they weren't. So we had more predictability with these efficient animals. And so with that, we said, okay, we see that with the non-lactating animals. What are we going to see with lactating? But first off, let me show you another study or show you some more data here. All right, we looked at how fast they eat the forage. Okay, think about it for a minute. What's a cow? What can she change? She can change how long she grazes. She can change how fast she grazes. She can change what she grazes. Okay? Bite rate, grazing time, and how much she eats per bite. And so bite rate, we didn't see any, in this study, we didn't see any difference between the efficient and inefficient animals, how fast they ate. But what we did see is that when we started looking at this in the third week of November, they were eating about 55 bites a minute. And as the days got colder and as the days got shorter, their bite rate increased to about 85 bites a minute. That's a lot. That's a lot. In the summertime, you might see 35 to 50 bites per minute. So what they're trying to get in nutrients, and they often change what they eat at this time of the year. You'll see them eating a lot of sandberg bluegrass, cheatgrass. That's why this late season grazing on cheatgrass is kind of effective. They're going after fine textured grasses that they can eat fast and they don't have to chew as much to try and satisfy the nutritional demands. We had another study up there. We looked at animals that were supplemented and weren't supplemented. And we were looking at how, and they either stayed in the same pasture or they didn't. The supplemented cows, they got 7 pounds of dry distiller's grain cubes fed once a week. And in 2016, when we brought them out of that, the pasture, the snow was knee deep and it was 4 degrees. That was Snowmageddon year, if you remember that. In 2017, there's little snow and the temperatures were warmer, about 8 degrees. So here's the activity of cows in the wintertime. You'll see them standing broadside to the sun to try and warm up. A smart cow, she'll even, if she's got hills in the pasture, she'll get in front of a hill, so not only she's getting the sunlight, but whatever bounces off the ground behind her. All right, in 2016, the rough year, we had the cows, they grazed more in the early morning hours and in the late evening hours because they're trying to stay warm. They're uncomfortable, they're gonna move around, they're gonna graze more. And then they rested more in the middle part of the day, just to try and warm up as compared to 2017. Here, this is grazing time in green, hours per day, resting time in blue, walking in yellow. In 2016, there was no difference between the two groups, efficient versus inefficient. In 2017, the inefficient cows, they rested less and walked more. So think about that, what's going on. They're search grazing. They're, instead of just putting their head down and grazing along purposely, that nutritional demand that they have, they need more nutrients. They're going to be meandering more as they're looking for better quality stuff to eat. And the animals that got supplement, they had less of that nutritional demand, so they ate faster, ate more bites. So again, it's the same type of thing. All right, so now let's move down with lactating cows down near Haley, Idaho. This is our research ranch, Rock Creek Ranch, and it's located just outside of Haley. And so we've got some terrain and these pastures that we're using, so we can test those animals. We did determine forage intake one year, and we just bolused with 6 of these gelatin capsules. That's 2 doses with a bolus gun. And those capsules contain a known amount of a long chain carbon molecule. It's called an alkane. And if we know how much we give them, and then if we follow them around and collect their manure over 4 days, by dilution, we can figure out how much forage intake they have. So we did that. So there they are, and there's Carmen getting a fecal sample. And we cordoned off a portion of the pasture, 83 acres, to make that easier to do. All right, let's do the grazing behavior here. This is in the spring of 2017. If you see a thermometer on these slides in blue, that means the temperatures are mild. We had really no real heat load on these animals. And given the opportunity and those cooler temperatures, the inefficient cows with greater appetite, they graze longer. They grazed 1.7 hours longer in this 5-day period. Here, let's look at, here's a day in August, and the high temperature is 73 degrees here. And here's another day, and the high temperatures were 86. And so on the mild day, the inefficient cows grazed 1.5 hours longer than did the efficient cows. But when the temperatures got hot, the efficient cows grazed 2 hours longer than inefficient cows. So what's going on? It has to do with heat load. Think about it this way. If you got a hot rod engine, a 454, 390, you had a muscle car from the 1970s, and you compared the heat generated by that engine to the heat from a Volkswagen Beetle, which do you think would produce more heat? The big engine, right? They have big radiators. So an animal that eats more, they're going to have a bigger GI tract. That's an advantage in the wintertime, creates heat. It's not an advantage in the summertime, so that's what's going on. And here's the efficient versus inefficient in the spring, and the inefficient graze more in the earlier hours and extend their grazing period longer in the morning. But as soon as you change to the summertime, hot temperatures, we didn't have that difference here. And what we did see is in late afternoon, these efficient cows got up earlier to start grazing. Does that make sense? They have less heat load, they're less affected. And the inefficient animals with more heat load are going to spend more time laying down in the shade and get up and start eating later in the afternoon. Here's the principle I want to talk about. Temperature and humidity index, or THI. And some of you are familiar with that concept. It just looks at the average temperature and the average humidity, and you can determine if an animal is going to be in heat stress or not. It's just like a switch. You can see it immediately. So when an animal gets in mild heat stress, that's going to be at that number 72. And in our average type humidity that we have here in Idaho, that's going to be about 84 or 85 degrees. So as soon as we hit that temperature, she's going to be in heat stress, mild heat stress. And so that affects their activity. So you can see here in late summer, we're in heat stress all the way from noon to 6 p.m. on that particular day. All right, so here's the results of some of that. These are two cows that are representative of their groups. The one in green is an efficient cow. The one in purple is an inefficient cow. And these are all the hot days. These are the GPS locations for all the hot days in August of 2016. And the efficient cows got up and climbed in the hills. The inefficient cows spent more time laying down, resting down at the bottom end of the pasture. And with our forage intake study, here's the digestive field. This is the amount of feed in the gut. And there was no difference from spring to summer with the efficient cows, not a statistical difference, but there was a big difference in the inefficient cows. As we moved into summer, they had more digestive field, which creates heat. Here's their forage intake. There's no statistical differences, but you can see from differences arithmetically from spring to summer for the two different groups. Two different strategies used by these animals, and when they went from spring to summer, the efficient cattle just started grazing faster, taking more bites per minute. The inefficient cows need more nutrients, they graze longer. So think about that. That has a cost to it. These are, we're not going to spend much time going over this. This is just their production. So cow weights, weaning weights, body condition, milk production, none of that differed between the two groups. So the efficient cows were able to graze more sustainably, possibly, but with no production loss. We found some gene markers between, this wasn't related to efficient versus inefficient, but we found gene markers for cows that climbed. Hill climbing cattle, here's a cow with one copy of the gene, Here's a cow with no copies of the gene. No, this cow had 2 copies of the gene. This cow had 1. This had none. And this is the maximum slopes that they use. So you can see a linear response. And we found 5 different gene markers. So in the future, we're going to be able to predict what type of animals might use some of these rugged rangelands more easily. And New Mexico State has also found similar thing. All right, so now let's get into this last study. So what stresses you? Okay, I won't tell you about, I was stressed last summer and I didn't even know it. So we were out doing research, Scott and a bunch of us. It was 97 degrees out there. And I was out there all afternoon, walking around in the hills, doing different things. And it was so hot that when I picked up a steel post driver, I didn't have gloves on. I burnt blisters on my hands. And I got back to the motel. I just turned 71 in January 4th, just Monday. Or Sunday, whenever it was Monday. Monday, I was 71 years old. And this summer, I got back to the motel and just dragging. Oh, man, I'm finally getting old. I'm 70 years old and it's catching up to me. I'm just exhausted. And then I went and got something to eat and I got some Gatorade and it's just like a switch had turned on. I felt like my old self. Now I think, well, I'm going to be just like Boots O'Neill and go till I'm 90. But let's talk about stress and what it does in an animal. And it's the same with us, but let's talk about cattle. And so we're going to do some biochemistry, but I promise you that we're going to keep it simple. And if you have any questions, Bill Evener's in the audience and he'll address those later. So in our cells, we have mitochondria. Those are the powerhouses of the cell. The interesting thing about mitochondria is that it's almost exclusively inherited from your mother. It's like that with all mammals. So the powerhouse of your cell, you can blame on your mother, okay? Or be grateful.
Right.
So what happens is we have oxygen and nutrients go into the mitochondria and it produces energy. It comes out in this ATP molecule and other byproducts. But as we're doing that, we have free radicals. And you've probably heard some of that. The free radicals are incomplete changes from one product to another. And so what we have is we've got superoxide, we got hydrogen peroxide, we got singlet oxygen, we got regular oxygen. So think about when you get a cut and you pour some hydrogen peroxide on it. Burns a little bit. So that can create some problems in the cells as well. When we get too many of those free radicals, then it affects cellular function. And what we got enzymes, we got these superoxide dismutase. Here's one here, here's one here, here's one in mitochondria. So there's 3 of those inside the cell. Outside the cell, we got glutathione, peroxidase. Those enzymes help convert those free radicals into something that won't damage the cell. And these enzymes contain copper, zinc, manganese, and selenium. And so those are important for keeping those regulatory mechanisms going. And we'll just skip down here. So that's the reasoning behind wanting to use these products. This graduate student, he wanted to see if we gave some of those cows some of that injectable trace mineral, would that help them have less stress? So we had 36 cows. We had 18 efficient, 18 inefficient. And then we had their calves. And so half of the cows got injectable trace mineral, and we repeated this for 2 years. And then we looked at some of the regulatory enzymes as well. We gave them the shots, the ones that got the shot, the 50% of the cows that got the shots, they got a shot 3 weeks before turnout, and then they got another shot 60 days later. The life of those minerals, the copper, selenium, and zinc will last about 20, 30 days. The selenium will last 40 to 60 days. Now let's show you some of the results. First off, here's our forage in the springtime. And here it is in the summer. And real good forage quality in the spring, 13% crude protein, about 67 to 71% TDN, which is really good. And then in the summer, it was dropping down to about 6 to 7% crude protein. And the TDN was about 60, 61%. All right. This is the activity of that glutathione peroxidase molecule. And we had much higher activity in August than we did in the spring. And then this is the other one. And so all that is telling us is that these animals are stressed. If there's much more enzyme activity, it means they're trying to fight off some of that heat stress that they're facing. Here's some of the grazing behavior. This is the efficient versus inefficient animals. This is in May of 2021. There's 0 hours that they're in heat stress. And so those cows, inefficient cows, they graze more from 2 to 4 p.m. and more from 8 to 10 p.m. Here, we're moving into July of 2021, and the cows are experiencing 10 hours a day in heat stress. And the treated cows, the ones that got the mineral, they got up earlier in the morning in the 6 to 8 a.m. They started grazing earlier in the morning than did the other ones. Yeah. Here's their daily travel distance, miles they traveled. The efficient treated cows, they walked more than did the inefficient treated cows, and walked more than the control efficient cows. Here's resting behavior for May of 2022. And the main thing to look at this slide is that the cows that got the inefficient cows that got the mineral treatment, they rested less than did the control cows, inefficient. So the injectable mineral reduced the resting behavior for those inefficient cows. Here's looking at their grazing, walking, resting time from spring to summer. 0 hours in heat stress, 9 hours in heat stress. This is in 2022. No difference between the efficient and inefficient cows in May. No differences in July. A little bit of arithmetic difference in resting for the rest of the inefficient cows. Here's the same thing, but looking at whether they got the shot or not. What we saw was in July, these cows that got the shot walked more than the control cows. So what's that mean? More mobility, feeling better. Here's some calves. We didn't see any significant differences in them. I'll just show you some differences. They rested about an hour or two more than the cows. They grazed about 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours less. In the springtime, they walked and nursed about the same amount, 2 hours each. In May, in July, milk production's going down. They're nursing half as much, and they pick up their grazing a little bit. All right, here's some day-to-day variation that I want to show you. We had some data where the cows started on one day, they walked all the way from one side of the mountain to the other side of the mountain and back again. And so they usually travel about 2.5 miles a day. They traveled 13 miles that day. So, all right, so I asked the cattle manager, did you move the cattle that day? No, we did not. We thought, well, maybe it's predators. We had some wildlife cameras that Jason Carl had set up in the pasture. We didn't see any problems that way. Well, what Jason and his students did find out is that on the day preceding and the day of, we had a lot more wind. So here's some little trees that are bent over. And so it relieved some of that heat load for the animals. Here's the day after. The night on the 20th, temperatures are 96 degrees, little wind. Here's how we saw some differences. Now these white cows are inefficient cows. This is their inefficient calves or calves from them. And this is walking time. If you see the presence of an animal within each 2-hour time period, that means they walked more than their counterpart. So these inefficient cows walked more than the efficient cows on these 2 days that they had less heat load. And the hours that they had heat load is shown in the amount of red that we have on the clock. On this long travel day, the inefficient cows walked about 2.5 miles more than did the efficient animals. On the day following, the calves were 290 meters away from the cows, and the calves from the efficient cows were right on the cows. So what happened? Those inefficient calves, they got tuckered out. All right, I need to move on here. Here's the injectable mineral thing. This means either an efficient cow or her calf grazed more during these time periods. The only time we had an inefficient cow graze more was in the late at night on one day. So the injectable mineral mitigates some of the effects of stress, heat stress. Here's the home range. This is 1,327 acres. This is calves from the treated cows compared to the control group, 1,220 acres. You can see a big difference. They didn't use much of that part of the pasture, and these did. I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to just...
You're good.
You're good? Okay, we'll cover this. All right, so when it's cool, cows like to use the south facing slopes, don't they? There's more heat there, and oftentimes the grass can be greener if you got any annuals. Let's look in 2021 when we had that heat dome. Do you remember that? In British Columbia, it was 118 degrees. We didn't get that hot, but we got pretty hot. And so this is the Kent Canyon pasture. This is a key area. I'll show you a picture in a minute. Here's another one. Here's a key area. This is in 2020. These are cow pies. It wasn't used heavily, but we had 10% use here. In 2021, during the heat dome, we had 0% use there. And we had 6 days that were over 90 degrees in 2021. Here's down along the spring. You can see these in 2020, these riparian grasses, sedges have been grazed off. They haven't touched the Great Basin wild rye. Here's in 2021, every one of those Great Basin wild rice have been grazed. A big meal in a small spot. They could harvest forage quickly there, and then they could go lay down and rest. So just the heat stress thing. Some of you want to know, well, what did it pay to do this? This is the economics. We had, in 2021, we got an extra 13 pounds wean weight from the calves that were on the cows that got the shots. The calves didn't get shots, but the cows did. In 2022, we got 10 pounds. We looked at the market price, the cost of the injectable mineral, and we charge a chute fee for working the cows. We made $15 net profit per calf in 2021 and $11 in 2022. So not only were we seeing some benefit in the cow behavior, but it also paid off as well.
In an ideal situation, ranchers and range managers like to see cattle actively grazing on a broad spectrum of the range. Especially on hot summer days, some cattle like to hang out in the shade and creek bottoms to stay cool. Often it requires herding cattle uphill to remove them from streams and riparian areas. But what if a cow is genetically inclined to climb hills? In a new research study, University of Idaho beef specialist Jim Sprinkle and his partners have identified a genetic marker for hill climbing cattle. These animals, shown in the green dots on the slide, hiked more, ate less, but still had optimal weight gain. The implications of the study are significant for overall range health, experts say.
All things considered, when we can get cattle that really will venture out and utilize better, the range stays in better condition, especially those riparian areas stay in a lot better condition. And I really think for the overall long-term health of the range, and which includes those riparian areas, then it's really gonna help provide an opportunity to do a better job of managing.
Cattle use of riparian areas is a big deal on public lands. For ranchers, meeting required riparian standards is important for maintaining their grazing permits. It's an important issue for anglers, hunters, and the general public as well. Many species of birds and wildlife benefit from healthy riparian areas. Healthy riparian areas also provide quality fish habitat, reduced water temperatures, and good water quality. From the standpoint of Wyatt Prescott, range manager at the University of Idaho Rinker Rock Creek Ranch, the study's findings are significant.
We're really trying to figure out how we can use livestock as a tool for conservation and to enhance wildlife habitat.
Now, I think this information is very significant, and it's like most things, the more that we learn, then the better we're able to manage.
Sprinkle created one-of-a-kind collars for cattle equipped with an accelerometer and GPS to track their movements. The accelerometer measures the cow's activity 25 times per second. The GPS tracks movements every 2 to 7 minutes.
It's pretty powerful, the accelerometers. They use them on rockets. It measures velocity up and down, side to side, backward and forward. The GPS will tell you where they're at. The accelerometer will tell you what they're doing while they're there.
Sprinkle and research assistants ground-proof the data by recording cattle activity on tablets while riding horseback.
Lots of data. Millions of lines of data, millions. Each cow, each day, we get 2.16 million lines of data. We average it down to 180,000 lines of data for each day. We got 35 cows.
For the research project, Sprinkle and his graduate student Landon Sullivan compared the movements of 18 efficient cows versus 18 inefficient cows over several grazing seasons at Rinker Rock Creek Ranch. To get started, they ran mother cows through a squeeze chute to place the collars on the animals. Sprinkle and his crew had all of the collars laid out and organized. They painted numbers on the mother cows for easier identification. Jim Sprinkle wanted to see how cattle with different eating habits in a feedlot setting would perform on the range. In the study, efficient and inefficient cattle were observed in a true rangeland setting at the ranch.
They've done this work since about the 80s, but they haven't really looked at these animals out on rangeland to any great extent. And so when I came here in 2015, I saw a real opportunity to evaluate these efficient versus inefficient animals on rangeland and see if there was any differences.
Using a car analogy, the inefficient cows in a feedlot setting were heavy eaters and required a lot of fuel, like a 1970s muscle car. The efficient cattle ate less in a feedlot, but still had the same amount of weight gain, more like a turbocharged sports car. And the efficient cows turned out to be the champion hill climbers. The inefficient cattle were more lazy, hanging out in the creek bottom, especially when temperatures got hot in August.
My original thinking was that we probably want inefficient animals out here because we want animals with a lot of drive and appetite that's going to get out and forage. And that's the beauty of science. When we did the experiments, it just turned that right upside down. And so we have determined those efficient animals, when you have steep terrain and you've got hot temperatures, they seem to handle a little better than the inefficient animals.
Ranchers may want to select for hill climbing cattle if they have a range operation.
But if you have the opportunity to select an animal that is going to eat a little less and use more rugged country, especially when it's hot, it might be something to consider.
Prescott sees a lot of value in the research findings for Idaho ranchers because the study was completed in a true rangeland setting at Rinker Rock Creek Ranch.
We're really trying to make sure that the research conducted is super applicable to those ranchers and to those ranchers that are trying to use livestock as a conservation tool and create a better environment for not only their years to come, but for wildlife and all the public to enjoy.
Sergio Arispe, a professor of range science for Oregon State University, has been assisting in the research.
Right, what I'm excited about is really, we're currently at the forefront of understanding and learning more about cattle behavior. Once again, the cattle behavior is important for landscape management in the sagebrush steppe. What's also unique about this project is that it's answering questions that cattle producers have. And not only cattle producers, but public land managers as well. And so it's the combination of rangeland-based operations, academia, public land managers, and also industry all coming together to promote functionally healthy ecosystems. And so I would say this project is at the forefront and what we're all looking at and learning from so that it can move beyond Idaho and really impact the world.
For more information about the study, contact Jim Sprinkle at sprinkle@uidaho.edu.
All right, so this last slide. Hopefully you'll have a question or two and we can answer it before we eat lunch. I tried to race through some of it, get us back on schedule. But just the conclusions, the gene markers exist for hill climbing cattle. The inefficient cows engage in more search grazing. The efficient cows tend to be more purposeful about how they graze. The injectable trace mineral improved foraging behavior over 2 summers. The inefficient cattle are more impacted by heat. And when we use the injectable mineral, we kind of help mitigate that and make them more comparable to the efficient animals. The calves mirror cow activity, but not always. I skipped over the slide that showed this, but you've heard old cowboys talk about babysitter cows. That's a real thing. And we've seen that in one slide I skipped over. We had the cow that went to water. Her calf stayed behind with the babysitter cows. And then the cow came back and got her. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I got one online. It says, would the difference between the efficient and inefficient cows be as significant if the cows were rotationally grazed daily?
Would the difference between efficient and inefficient animals be as great if they were rotated daily? I think it depends on how much terrain you have. If you were having flat terrain, it might not be much different. But I think they're going to still show the effects of stress because you're still going to have those hours per day that they're in heat stress, and they're going to manifest that in some way. And I showed the slide that had just one day in August when the temperatures were hot and when they weren't, and we've seen differences. Yes.
Jim, did you guys see any difference in the efficiency of the cows or the data between efficient and inefficient when the forage availability changed? It's like when you go out on a pasture, it's easier to get a bite and get your fill as opposed to when you get heavier utilization, a cow has to work longer to get her belly full.
Well, that's a great question. The question was, what about forage availability? And would we see a difference? You would intuitively expect that if the forage availability is less, they're going to graze more hours per day. So if the animal has a demand for more nutrients, they're going to still try to graze more per day up to the point of fatigue, which is usually about 12 or 13 hours a day. That said, we didn't really have a problem with availability. The ranch is somewhat understocked. So our highest utilization ranges usually are in the 20s to maybe a low 30%. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and I guess it might be relative to how you manage your range. And you're looking at, what you're bringing home at the end of the summer, there's like a bigger wait till you get every night of grass gone. Or is it paying off, or should you just keep bumping and stay on better grass?
Yeah, well, obviously, if you made the point of, if you trying to take everything versus trying to move along and use better quality stuff, then yeah, that's true. They're gonna get more nutrients, better quality forage as they move into a fresh pasture. That answer?
So
Well, it's right here and then back there. Yeah.
So the genetic markers are very interesting. So this is like a multi-part question. So did you notice that, Herefords versus Venus versus Charlotte? Or did you, and then are we seeing producers that are breeding for that? I mean, obviously, I can think of, cows that are grazing on the Sawtooth National Recreation Area or catch up a Fairfield versus maybe what's down, on the Jarvis Field office with the BLM, where it's not as mountain. So if any of those discussions come up, that's just fascinating. Now I want to go to take a genetics course, but I'm too old. I don't know.
So the question was, breed differences in these markers. We only did research with Hereford Angus crosses. But the New Mexico state people, they conducted research all over the West, and so they found the same thing. So, you're gonna have those markers in every breed. Now, there might be some differences between breeds, and I think there would be. For instance, if you think about cattle breeds that were developed in mountainous areas of the world, like the Tartary cattle, they have found that those animals will use more difficult terrain, and they probably are carrying some markers that allow them to do that over genetic time. There's a question back here.
Yeah, for your feed efficiency test, what was the ration? Was it a high concentrate ration or low profit ration?
Yeah, the question was, did we feed concentrates or roughage for the feed efficiency tests? And we fed a high roughage, 85% hay ration. And we just chopped the forage and they mix a little bit of molasses into it. Or not molasses, what is it?
It's a molasses based vitamin mineral premix.
Yeah, and it's to help keep the dust down and so forth. Yeah, so primarily forage because we want to imitate what they're going to be eating out on pasture and range. Another question? Yeah.
Did you say that it's mainly like a heat dissipation, so in a winter grazing situation, the inefficient cows actually do better?
Well, the question was, do inefficient cows do better in winter situation? They're able to get more heat from their gut. That's the advantage. But the study that we did in DuBois was done on late season forage, and we had snow and cold weather. So the inefficient animals still lost more weight than did the efficient animals because they have more maintenance requirements.
Were the inefficient animals like more responsive to supplement?
That study, we didn't do it. The next study we had efficient, inefficient. We didn't see really any differences in how they responded to the supplement. I think we'd need more numbers of animals, more studies to really see if there is a difference that way in how they use the nutrients. Yes.
Regard to efficient and inefficient cows, is there any difference in the gut microbiome?
The question was, is there any difference in the gut microbiome of efficient versus inefficient cows? Research says yes. That those efficient animals do have a slightly different microbe. So the ways in which they have determined that probably these animals are differing is, one thing is in protein turnover. The efficient animals probably have less of that. The heat of fermentation that we've talked about, there's some differences there. There might be some differences in digestibility, but that's really hard to get at. There's another question.
Another question in chat. Is there a way to prevent inefficiency in cattle?
Question, is there a way to prevent inefficiency in cattle? The only thing I can think of is that we don't have the knowledge. If there's something you could do to the cow while that baby is in utero, we might be able to make her more efficient, but you still have the genetics plan effort. Then, as far as day-to-day management on making them cow inefficient, I think what was mentioned right here, keeping fresh forage in front of them as much as possible, keeping the utilization rates low so that they have more choices. You know, things like if you don't have trees, putting up shade cloths, things like that to help relieve some of that. Here and then there, yes.
I think your results have some implications that could put the work in plant material selection for post-fire rehab as well. 'Cause you were talking about animals selecting for the finer forages that are easier to bite and digest.
That's in the winter.
And I think there's implication to that during the growing season too, because if a cow doesn't want to eat it, it's not going to. And if it's not gonna eat it, I've been a long proponent that it just turns to fuel.
Yeah.
And so that can be something for people to consider your results as to how we're selecting plant materials to go and restore rangeland, whether it's to replace the annuals or to restore fallen fire.
Yeah, I mean, you know that they change from season to season. So like down at Wrinkle Rock Creek Ranch in May and early June, their preferred forage is Great Basin Wild Rye. It's a big, robust plant. As soon as that plant turns yellow, they back right off of it. But yeah, there's a question back here.
Is there a geographic difference? So like cattle from Arizona, are they more efficient than cattle in Idaho? Because they have to dissipate more heat.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. Are cattle, like from Arizona, more efficient because they've had to dissipate heat? You would think that over time, there would be some genetic migration that would possibly influence that. But that would be pretty difficult to determine. You're still gonna see the differences. I mean, I was in Arizona for 20 years and we had a scientist that was working with efficient versus inefficient. You still see differences within the breed and within the group of cattle that you're looking at. But there's no question that if an animal is adapted to a region, there's probably some long-term genetics that go into that over time. We'll have to let Dr. Glaze give us more on that eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nope, another question. It's the.
that's the last question. Okay, this is the last question. All right, go ahead.
So like the inefficient and efficient animals, are they pretty evenly distributed? Like, can you make improvements through selection in inefficient animals by pulling?
Yeah, are the inefficient and efficient animals evenly distributed? We found something interesting when we started doing this research. The animals had been used to being on irrigated pasture, and we could kind of take a cut, you know, half the animals would be kind of average and the other quarter would be efficient and the other quarter would be inefficient. But over time, Dr. Hall's found that as we looked at these animals on rangeland, what have you seen, Dr. Hall?
Well, the way feed efficiency testing is done is we test within a cohort. So within any given year, we're gonna have a bell-shaped curve of efficient and inefficient cattle. So there's always gonna be about 25% efficient, 25% inefficient. Now, what we haven't been able to do is go back and say, have we changed those calves over time by comparing amongst years? And so that's one thing we're not able to do. But to answer the question, yes, we can select for feed efficiency. And using those selection tools, we can develop animals that are more feed efficient over time.
Can I follow up?
Sure. All right, go ahead.
So is the,
Give me that
so
microphone.
it's kind of a chicken and egg question. So can you use feed efficiency to get animals that are hill climbers that have the markers? Or could you use that marker to get animals that are feed efficient?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't pinned it to efficient versus inefficient, but with some of the research New Mexico State did with the grad students at Colorado State, there seems to be a relationship that the efficient seem to have more hill climbing ability, but we haven't specifically pinpointed that yet. We hope to gather more of that information as we analyze this DNA. And I think that's it.